It's wonderful to see so many old friends here and also so many new friends. Welcome to all of you. There is a story that you've certainly, most of you have heard. It's one Master enjoyed telling. It was about 6 blind men and an elephant. And you all know the story. It's worth repeating. There was this man who had an elephant, and all his 6 children, were blind. And he asked them one day to wash the elephant. And afterwards, they all sort of were getting together and trying to decide among themselves what the elephant was really like. They couldn't see it, but they had all experienced certain aspects of it. And one of them said, "Well, I know what it is. It's a little rope hanging down from the sky." He'd been washing the tail. And the other said, "Well, I don't know how you can say that. It's 4 big pillars." And the third said, "But no, it's a couple of fans." And the other one said, "No, wait a minute. I know, I've had experience of it. It's not a string, but it does hang down. It's a snake. And it sort of wiggles." And the last one said, "Well, no, my brothers, I don't know how you can be so blind. The elephant is a big wall. He'd been washing the sides." And just then the father came in, and the father heard them arguing, and he laughed. He said, "My boys, you're all right and you're all wrong." And they said, "Well, how can that be?" He said, "Well, because you've each one been experiencing only an aspect of the elephant, but the elephant is all those things together. And so it is with God and with the lives of great masters and with truth, that we tend to think that whatever we've experienced is the definition. And when I think of this story as applied to Master, it's interesting to see how different disciples have really quite a different take on who he was. We lived with him, we experienced him, we all heard his words. Somehow, each one of us understood according to his own nature and according also to the needs of the times. For example, Dr. Lewis in the beginning, and people more or less of his generation, you might say. He was a trained dentist and knew about medicine and the way many parts of the body work. And he thought of Master's teachings in reference to not only the experiences he'd had in meditation, but always with reference to some sort of thing that was known. He couldn't quite get the idea that this was something new and different, although he knew it also. But it was a very sort of a one-sided view of Master, not a wrong one at all, just his view. And it was very difficult for Dr. Lewis in the early days to imagine when Master talked about how his work would spread and they'd have buildings and everything. And Dr. Lewis would say, "But when? He couldn't imagine it. There Master was in a little rooming house in Massachusetts. It just didn't seem, the few people who used to come and hear him lecture, you couldn't imagine from that this man would be as powerful a messenger as he proved to be. Indeed, in his years of campaigning and lecturing around the country, he was really very probably the most popular and prominent lecturer in America. And yet, it was very difficult for Dr. Lewis to understand that, understandably. And so, when Master did get all these things, and it did come true, and Dr. Lewis finally moved out, he still had that kind of take on Master that was much more personal. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. That's his particular. See, each one of us comes into this world with certain samskars, certain tendencies. We have certain needs that need to be fulfilled. And some people find fulfillment in one aspect of the Master, others in another. This was Doctor's way. I remember Dr. Lewis talking about when they were young men together in Massachusetts, they'd wrestle together. And Doctor said, sort of, with a slight hint of condescension, well, I let him beat me. Well, you know, darn well Master could have beaten him. He was up there on the stage in Boston, and had 6 policemen come up they got up on the platform Master wanted to show the strength he'd developed through yoga, and these men were all leaning against his stomach to hold him against the wall. He said, okay, are you ready? Yeah, like that. And Master sort of popped his belly out, and they all fell into the orchestra pit. This quality of strength was something that was basic to him. But Doctor couldn't quite, there was still, you just put yourself in his shoes too. Here, a young man comes, I don't know exactly how old, about 27, and he's not quite fluent in English. We always tend to make a little bit of fun of foreign accents, although we appreciate them also. But much humor in all languages is based on foreign accents, isn't it? And so, Master with his foreign accent, who could tell? How could you know? There was a great love for Master that Dr. Lewis had, but it was always sort of within that framework. Well, who's to say any framework's the real one? Just one blind man trying to wash the elephant, that's all. And then Master, in his years, as he developed his work, it would be natural that the people who were with him at that time would remember what it was like to be with him as a person. His mission wouldn't be nearly so impressive to them unless they had a sense of that mission, but they don't seem to have had. The teachers that he had, they were most of them people who had been lecturers already, but Master wanted to draw people in who would help to spread the message, and these people were willing to work with him. There was one letter he told me he got from Father Divine. Father Divine was a man in Harlem who was, he pretended to be God. And he had this, Master told me, he had this chair with above the back of the chair it said, God. And he, when he wrote to there was somebody sued him for something or other, and the judge was prejudiced against him, and the judge died in the middle of this case. And Father Divine said, I hated to do it. Well, anyway, Master told me that Father Divine had written him this letter suggesting they work together. And he ended his letter saying, I'm healthy, happy, in every molecule, bone, muscle, and atom, underlined 3 times. Master had a good time about this. He sort of was laughing about the human comedy. But he had a lot of teachers. Some of them were well known in their own field. There was a Dr. Roman Ostoja, who was from Poland and was a well-known lecturer. He had certain spiritual powers. And Master told us one time how Dr. Ostoja was to introduce him to a lecture hall. And the hall was full because people would come to hear Master. Well, Ostoja didn't, after all, just another person from the Orient. I'm at least from Europe kind of thing. And so he was to do the introduction. And he began talking a little bit, and he said, and now I will tell you a most wonderful thing. And he didn't tell it, but he went on talking and talking. And now I will tell you a most wonderful thing. Went on talking. People began getting up and walking out. This was taking over the whole lecture time. And finally, when there were a few people left to hear Master lecture, he said, and now I will tell you a most wonderful thing. Keep the corners of the mouth up. Well, nobody could do that if he had any sense of whom he was introducing. Mind you, it was not so easy in the beginning. Look at all the Christians who felt that here's a heathen coming. Look at all the whites who thought here's a black, and there was still that prejudice. It's much less now, but it was more a reality then. look at all the scientists who felt that we have a corner on truth, and who's this guy talking about ecstasy and meditation and so on. And we have the Christian, more serious Christians who would have their saintly tradition. Yeah, but he's not like St. Francis. And so they'd compare, as they always do. They're always comparing the modern saint with past saints, not realizing that each saint is himself. Each one is unique. And it's wrong to compare in that way. This was one thing that Saint Rats, I can't think of his name. Somebody here knows it. Come on, you know it, Pat. Saint something, the new theologian. Simeon, the new theologian. Had to look at you and then I remembered it. And he said that don't compare with the past. What I am giving you, I've received in a straight line of succession from Christ himself through the apostles. This is the truth today. Don't look at the way others have done it. That was what was needed at that time. Truth doesn't change, but the presentation of that truth does change. And he was asking the simple question. This was a paper I discovered. It was actually written in French. And just a moment. It was written in French, translated from the Greek of St. Simeon, the new theologian. But the question that he posed was, are you baptized if you aren't aware of any real change in yourself? He said he had heard many people saying that because of dogma, you had to assume that you had put on Christ when you were baptized. He said, when you put on clothes, aren't you aware that you've got something on? And if you aren't, I must verily say that you must be dead. You couldn't be wearing clothes and not even know it. And so what he said was that we have to have the experience of something if we're going to receive Christ, if we're going to receive God, if we're going to have the experience of God. It's got to be an experience. It can't just be a dogma. He was a yogi. He was teaching just the same things the yogis have taught. There's no difference. Truth is truth. But each person comes and gives it in a different way. Each group of disciples come and understand different aspects of it. And so altogether too many, in fact, I don't know, unfortunately, of an exception, of those teachers who came to teach with Master, each one of them thought he was the teacher. And Master was just another one, but he was always in a sense of sort of rivalry. Well, now, looking back at that, it seems just ridiculous. But that was an understandable delusion, mistake. When you're seeing somebody for the first time and you don't know what his past is, I had the advantage of reading autobiography of a yogi. That was a big advantage. I'd had the advantage of not knowing anything. That was a great advantage. These people all had their own sort of web of education in these matters. And so Master really had to stand alone. And he became, for those who were close to him, two things. One, a very lovable, deeply admirable, highly spiritual person, but his work in the public was something not that important, because they saw all the people who worked in the public were allowing it to go to their heads. And so it became the in thing for the people living around him to just think that the whole purpose of our life is discipleship, being with him. Laurie Pratt said to me, I used to think in the beginning that he had come to this country to gather a handful of disciples and take us all to India. She never really had an idea of his mission as such. I know when I mentioned to Daya, when are we going to start community, she said, frankly, I'm not interested. And yet he talked about it with such fervor. But that public aspect of his work just didn't seem so real to them. And yet they fulfilled a wonderful purpose too. Each one has done something very valid for the wholeness of Master's mission. In their case, they're able to tell us what it was like to be with him all the time. I knew him for 3.5 years. That's a fair amount, actually. But to know him longer gives you a particular sense of his human reality. And it was a beautiful reality. They say no one is great in the eyes of his own valet. In Master's case, it wasn't like that. Those who were closest to him had the deepest perception of how great he was. And yet, their role was a particular one. Master, when he used to say to me, "You have a great work to do," he knew that my whole thrust was reaching out to people. When I said I knew nothing, I meant I didn't know yoga. I didn't know the word yoga. I didn't know the word karma. I never heard the word guru. I'd had a big debate with my brother on the subject of reincarnation, where he was saying it was possible, I was saying it was impossible. And I didn't know any of these aspects of things, nor did I know about saints. I didn't really know anybody could be a saint. I assumed a saint was somebody who smiled benignly. That was about as far as my understanding would go. And but I had studied an awful lot of things, and I had seen point after point that people were wondering, and there was confusion there. People didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know what they were looking for. There was a lot of misunderstanding of what life is all about. Well, I can get back to that. But the point is that when I came to Master, I was really fresh. And everything I took was his. But also after reading autobiography, I was so completely convinced that he knew what he was talking about. It was the first man I'd ever met who I felt knew what he was talking about. I'd met all sorts of people in all sorts of walks of life. It was almost my way to try to meet people of different walks. I was very gregarious in those days. I'd come to a town, and within a week I'd know half the people there. And when I went to Mexico, I met everybody from murderers to the nephew of the president to all sorts of people. I was fascinated. I wanted to know what makes people tick. And I remember one time down in Acapulco, these 3 young men invited me out on a little raft. And somebody fortunately said, "Don't go," and I listened. And later I was told, well, they just have got me out there and killed me, just for kicks. They had gotten nothing out of me, but you run a sort of risk when you travel and you don't know ways of behavior and so on. But this was my good karma, I suppose. Don't know what else to call it, bad maybe. But at any rate, I had this awareness of the world's desperate need. I so longed to help people to understand what life is all about. And I wanted to become a playwright and to help them to know, until finally one day it dawned on me that I didn't know. What kind of a fool was I to try to share with anybody my own ignorance? And I had done my best to avoid thinking about God, although I thought about him constantly, but I just felt nobody knows what he's talking about. Why get into something you can't prove, you can't know from experience? And so I kept pushing it aside until finally my own reasoning course led me to confront this fact that without God, life doesn't have any meaning. There's got to be something in it. I'd never met anybody like Master, though. Never anybody who really knew what he was talking about. After meeting him, that was my absolute authority. Boone would have all these wacky things that he'd read in different metaphysical books and so on. Sometimes he'd say things Master had said, but my question to him always was, did Master say that? If he said, well, no, I read it, then I'd forget about it. If he said, Master said it, then I'd listen. So I was already biased in favor of getting this message out, helping people to understand it, and knowing that I don't know anything. Nobody else seems to know anything, but here's one man who does. Now I know I've met others who do too. I've met other saints. It's been a great experience meeting them, spending time with them. But one thing I have to say is that Master none of them can compare with him. I say that certainly out of the particular loyalty and love of a disciple, but I say it also with just sort of overall you try to be impartial in these things. What I saw about Master was that he was so relaxed with being a master that he didn't have to hold the guard all the time. So many people are very severe in their spiritual understanding of things. Ramana Maharshi was a great master, but as Master said, he wasn't wholly liberated. And a woman came from London and said to him, "Sir, I've come a long distance to meet you." He said, "You haven't traveled at all. The scene has changed around you, but you remained the same." Well, that's a beautiful answer, a very true answer, but also a very, you might say, superhuman answer. I loved it. I would have loved it if Master had said that, and he might well have said it. But what I noticed about Master was that he was different for each person. He related to the reality of that person. He was so completely relaxed in his own inner oneness with God that he could approach you without having to give his particular take on anything. It was always beginning with your point of reference, taking it from that and showing how that point of reference related to a larger whole. He was the ideal master to send to the West. Nobody can say one master is greater than another. To speak of relativity in God is an absurdity. God is one. Truth is one. But he manifests himself in many different ways. And so saints are chosen for particular roles. What made him particular great was the role that he had to play in this life. It was ideal for this country at this time. It was ideal for the nature of Americans themselves. I read in a book somewhere, somebody said that the reason America is such a great country is that it has so many natural resources. Well, there are natural resources in many countries. Why is America different? Not because of those natural resources. Look at Japan. They don't really have any resources, but look what they've done. They have a great creative intelligence, and they're able to take the best of others, and they've been able to produce in that little tiny country a great culture. Well, this has been true in America in a particular way. People came to America because they wanted to live a new life. It was a new world. Somebody said to me from South America, and it's a very valid viewpoint too, that those who came to America first, the Pilgrim Fathers, came for God, came for spiritual freedom. He said, look at the people in South America. They came for gold. And look at South America today. It's still in chaos. They still can't seem to get their political system in order. It'll come together eventually. But look how America has flourished. Two things. One, great creative energy, a desire to do something new, a desire to find new solutions to things. There's a story about a group of people who were from different countries who were asked to write an essay on the elephant. And the Frenchman wrote about lovemaking among the elephants. And the German wrote about the uses of the elephant in time of war. The Italian wrote about the musical quality of the elephant's trumpeting. And the Englishman wrote about the aristocratic character of the elephant. Well, the American wrote about how to make bigger and better elephants. There's a lot of truth in it, and it's also delightful. And it is what the American temperament has been. They've always tried to think how to do things differently. You know, with Kriya, you won't all understand this, but if you've had Kriya, you will. That Master told us to put olive oil so we can feel a coolness in the throat. So I said to Bernard, well, why don't we mix a little mint oil with the olive oil, because it has a cool feeling. And I heard Master when Bernard told him this idea. Master was backstage at the Hollywood Church, and Master laughed. He said, oh, you Americans are always trying to improve. Well, this is the American way. And the other thing has been slightly put out of sight in all the hustle and bustle to build. But it's been a very deep reality in this country, one that the establishment and the intellectual and the press and those people who pretend to speak for the country have no idea about. And yet, surveys of people in this country have discovered repeatedly that between 90 and 95% of Americans believe in God. Well, that's quite astonishing for a country that prides itself on atheism. It's just that you're listening to the wrong people who are saying such things. And the other thing that they found is that there are some 25 or 30% of Americans practice something in the way of meditation or prayer or some effort to actually contact God. Well, Master said that the reason he was sent to this country was because Americans had wanted a technique for knowing him. I don't suppose the word came into their mind, technique, as such, but they're always looking for techniques to do everything. And there was this desire in the heart of the religious people in America, yeah, but it's not enough to have dogmas. I want to experience. And this has been the real reason why the Master chose America and why Master was sent here. But this down-to-earth practicality and this wish to make religion down-to-earth and practical is a particular aspect which nowadays, especially because America is such a great influence throughout the world, it's becoming an attitude that you find everywhere. And yet, it is a part of the mission that Master brought was to lift that practicality into the actual experience of God. Now, of course, when we speak of America's influencing the world, which it really is, you hear also a lot of diatribes against America in different countries, but you find that when people vote with their feet, they all want to come here. There's a reason for it. The other thing, however, is not America. It's that America, being a new country, being somewhat innocent of old traditions, America is open to new things. And here is where Dwapara comes into the picture. Master brought hope to the world through Dwapara. What is Dwapara? We've all heard that one too. Sri Yukteswar explained it as the movement of the sun around a dual, and the closer it comes to the central point in our galaxy, there are spiritual rays coming from that point, and when we're openly exposed to those, then we receive more spiritual energy, more enlightenment. If you look at the difference between genius and stupidity, essentially it's only this, energy. Geniuses never have dull eyes, they're always bright. And stupid people never have bright eyes, they're always dull. There's not the same amount of energy coming to the brain, whether because of blockages in the brain and the nervous system, not having used the brain properly, not having used it creatively, lots of reasons. But at any rate, you can see that it's the increase of energy that is beginning to wake man up. And it's very interesting to study how coming out of the nadir of this, which was not 499, or Sri Yukteswar balanced it out by saying 500 AD, how with that, you see a gradual awakening to knowledge that people had before. It isn't that Columbus discovered that the world is round. The ancient Greeks knew it. It isn't that Copernicus discovered that the universe doesn't go around the earth, that we go around the sun. They knew it in ancient times. The ancient Hindus said that as many motes as there are in a sunbeam, so are there worlds in the great scheme of things. Words like universe weren't known then. Words like element were used in different ways until now. And now chemists will say, well, they didn't know what elements were. Yes, they did. They just didn't think of them in the terms that chemistry has chosen to define them. But to the yogi, and in the yoga tradition, the elements of air and ether and air and fire and water and earth, do you know what these do? These simply delineate different phases of manifestation of the spirit into solid matter. On the lowest level is solid matter. Before that, everything is molten, liquid. Before that, everything's fire. Before that, in the galaxies, there's just the galactic gases. And behind that, there's ether and consciousness. They're just different definitions of the word element, but the truth has been known for ages. And so we see that this knowledge, and it's very interesting because every now and then people will say, now we know everything that can be known. I've read a number of books saying that. Scientists, people of high reputation in their field, declaring that we don't anticipate any more surprises. We have it pretty well set the way it is. 5 years pass and suddenly they've opened up a whole new universe, things those people never dreamed of. When Lobachevsky and Bolyai discovered spherical geometry, the people denounced them as mad. The only valid geometry was Euclid's, with flat planes. And finally they got to be accepted, at which time the chief mathematician in France admitted he'd had this idea long before, but had been afraid of being denounced as mad, and therefore didn't dare say it. But this was coming out. And again, why would two people and then a third? And who knows if others also didn't have that intuition? How are they suddenly discovering these things? Because the energy is coming up. New ideas are coming out. They're being planted in the minds of individuals. So that, for example, Darwin, when he made his discovery, it's been said many times that if he had not published when he did, 2 weeks later, if he'd waited 2 weeks to publish his theory of evolution, Wallace would have had the credit for having discovered it. Again and again you find that Leibniz in Germany and Newton in England discovered calculus almost simultaneously. Again and again you find that these things are not just one person's thinking it up in his brain and then somehow others think, hey, that's a hot idea and take to it. It's something that's coming up in consciousness, and people are beginning to become more and more attuned, so that the things that people discovered in recent centuries, to you and me today, even if we're complete babes in the woods on these things, we accept them as natural, not only because other people have discovered it, found it to be true, or we've seen that they work. More than that, there's something within our consciousness that has enabled us to recognize these truths. We vibrate with them. And there's a great deal to be thought about and contemplated on that. But let's go back to that little point of Sri Yukteswara's explanation of the sun going around a dual. Vyasa, in some very interesting classes that he's given on this subject, points out something that is really undeniable. The sun in 12,000 years can't move that much closer to the center of our galaxy for the closeness to be significant. So the explanation that we're closer to the galaxy center, the galactic center, or I should say, the grand central sun as Sri Yukteswara described it, and therefore we're more enlightened, that's not the explanation. It doesn't add up. But there is another one that's quite possible, and he touched on that in his classes too. And that is that when you have, and by the way, the idea of a dual sun, which is something that hasn't yet been discovered. Many things that he said would be discovered have been discovered. This is one that hasn't. And however, I have read, and it has been postulated by several astronomers, that maybe there is another sun, a dual of ours. Many stars have duals, but the thing is that hasn't yet been found. However, here's how it could work, that you have the sun here with something in the way. that has other rays coming out that prevent the clarity of that spiritual vibration coming from the galactic center to our Earth. Now, as that moves away, gradually, sort of like you move something over your eye and you can see more and more clearly. And so this obstruction moving more and more out of the way makes the vision more clear. However, that doesn't tell it all, because when it's here behind you and the center of the galaxy is there, you don't have any obstruction. So what we do have here, obviously, is some sort of other influence, which only when it's behind us does the full ray of spiritual enlightenment happen. Now, it's not my job, and nor would it even be my pleasure to go into what this could mean exactly. But it does seem to make sense that something's going on up there. And it does seem to make sense that this adds up to being an explanation why, when the clouds shift a little bit, when the energies are moving more behind us than in front of us, and when they're totally supportive, all of that could have a definite impact on what we receive in the emanations coming from the center of our galaxy. Makes sense. Doesn't matter very much to you and me. We're living right now. And yet it satisfies the mind to be able to comprehend how these things work, because then we can sort of go about the business of really getting on with it. We understand it. We understand this much of the truth, and so we can go with greater energy. Now, what we see in the age when the sun was in the way, when the rays of energy weren't coming very strongly, what we see, let's say around 500 AD, an absolute addiction to material form. Man could not understand anything except in terms of material form. Even as late as the early 18th century, Samuel Johnson heard about what Bishop Berkeley in Ireland had been talking about, saying that everything is really in the mind. And Johnson gave his faithful Boswell a kick in the pants, said, "Is that just in your mind?" Well, of course it didn't prove anything. As Master put it, if in your dream you hit your head against a wall, your dream head hurts. And so it meant simply that his dream behind was hurting. But that didn't mean that it wasn't a dream. That didn't mean that it wasn't in just in thought. But what you see with this is in every field, mankind was constricted and could not break out of that particular mold. We see it particularly in religion, that religion was there was this big fight. Master used to say that Jesus Christ was crucified once, but his teachings have been crucified countless times every day since then by people who didn't really know what his teachings were about. Well, the thing is, he was teaching at a time when people simply could not understand. Close disciples of his, their mother came to him and asked that they be on his right and left hand in heaven. This is a pretty materialistic view. Can you imagine Jesus sitting on a throne all through eternity like this? Sounds pretty ridiculous. The picture of God's consciousness being everywhere, however, was just totally beyond people. And the image that they used to have in the old days of heaven was all these saints and angels and cherubs and so on, ranged in rank down from there. It seems was a very static image of truth. Truth, as we now know, is just bubbling over with energy. Nothing is fixed, but in those days they tried to fix everything. They tried to fix teachings, make definite dogmas out of them. They tried to fix truth by making a religion out of it. And if you didn't agree with what was authoritatively declared, there was you were condemned as a heretic. to disagree with authority was considered unthinkable. Well, that's what Master meant when he said that Jesus Christ is being, his teachings, in other words, have been crucified. Because, as Master also said, I was sent to bring back original Christianity and the original yoga of Krishna. I was at a lunch that Master was giving, and I used to serve the dinner and then demonstrate the yoga postures afterwards. And there was this professor from Columbia University, and he said to Master, what was it he said? I thought of one thing and then something else that he said, and I forgot the first one. But anyway, this other thing that he said was that how lucky you came now, because people are more open to what you've come to teach. But I wish I could think of that. This is one problem with never preparing a lecture. I don't have notes to remind me, so I'm stuck. Anyway, the thing is that the churches, he said that was what it was. This professor said, why, since you teach that all religions are one, why do you confine your teaching to the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita and the Hindu scriptures? And Master's answer was not a philosophical discourse. He simply said that is what Babaji wanted. In other words, he came because he was sent to do this. He could have done any number of other things. People can say, well, why didn't he do that? Why didn't he do this? He came to do what he had to do. In other words, however, it was also not that he sort of got it in his own mind, here's a red-hot idea, let's do this. He had a particular mission to fulfill. And that mission, he said, was the teaching of original Christianity and original yoga. Now, what is original Christianity? We think we've got it. We've got the Bible. After Martin Luther, there's the thought that all you have to do is read the Bible and understand it. And then you have this big colloquy of Luther and Zwingli and Zurich, or whatever it was, and each of them, going by his own interpretation of the Bible, came up with a completely different idea, which certainly proves that merely reading the Bible isn't going to tell you what it's all about. It depends also on your understanding. I would think that if a turtle were to look at the Bible, or a copy of it, if it thought anything, it might wonder if it was good to eat. So, if we look at it from the standpoint of what people have done with it, we've seen that there are really only two oppositions here. One, there was a lot of turmoil, mostly as it is even in our age. One disciple of Master wrote to me when I was putting out Master's interpretations of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. He said that because there was one passage on Satan, and he wrote to me and he said, well, this is a disciple of Master, mind you. And he said, well, don't you know there's no such thing as Satan? He said, all ministers nowadays, modern and progressive ministers, are agreed. Well, my answer was, listen, your guru says it, you'd better believe it. But this arrogance is what happened even in the time of Christ. People had this great teaching, and each one sort of brought his own little thing here and there. But that wasn't so much of an obstacle. It shook itself down gradually. But the real battle in early Christianity was between the Gnostics and the Orthodox organizationalists, you might say. This was the real struggle. Yes, there was also the Arian heresy, in which Arius proclaimed, and this was a common illusion in those days too, that Jesus was just a good philosopher. How was he better than Socrates, kind of thing. But that was the problem you'll always find. Was this a man? Was this a son of God? Was this teaching man-made or was it divinely inspired? That was one of the big battles. But the big battle was, you notice in the book of the Acts of the Apostles, it talks repeatedly about communities. It talks about these people. Peter was getting people to give money, pool their resources so they could build communities. It made perfect sense. People who want to live for God, living surrounded by worldly people, can't help finding their focus, their energies diluted by that worldly consciousness. To get people to live together, dedicated to the same principles, is a natural, in fact inevitable, consequence of having a new way of thinking and living. It was the right thing to do. You never hear it in the Orthodox history. You hear the Gnostics who had deep teachings and foolish teachings too. Because when people go inside for their understanding, it depends on their level of understanding what they're going to be able to see. And so some of the Gnostics taught truths that were not spirited, they were not based in Jesus, the thing that a person should always do, and which one of these disciples I just mentioned in our time didn't do. Something that I think we should be rigidly orthodox about. Did Master say it? Is this what he taught? Don't disagree with that because you don't know what the truth is. You've come to him because you feel that he does know. I don't say be dogmatic, but given the great variety of answers that are out there, I've only met one person, well, I've met others since then, but at that time I had only met one who really I knew he knew. And having dedicated myself to that, after saying to him on September 12th, 1948, I want to be your disciple, I have never for one moment changed that idea. That's what our lives should be all about. Now, what happens, however, when you've got the Gnostics? Mind you, the Catholics, the Greek Orthodox, the Byzantine Church, all people who wanted to form this thing into a solid phalanx of agreement, all of them naturally would be against personal revelation. That's why saints today have to die before they'll make them saints. Of course, God makes the saints. But you never know what this guy's going to come out with until he's gone. And if everything he said is safely agreed to by the church, then all right. And some people have said, well, what about Padre Pio? He must have known that there were past lives. Well, my answer to that is just what Ananda Ma was. She came to endorse, to reinforce traditional orthodoxy. She would not then go against it. And she might not agree with all of it, but she wasn't there with that particular mission. And so Padre Pio, certainly he was in enough touch with the church anyway. If he had started teaching things that were against what the church teaches, where would he be? He'd have been put out long before. But I know that a friend of mine told me that he went to Padre Pio. He's an Italian, lived in Rome. And he went to Padre Pio once for confession. And he said to Padre Pio, oh, and I practice yoga. And Padre Pio said, shh, don't talk about these things, but you're doing the right thing. They know, they just can't say if they're going to fulfill the work they've been given to do. However, there has been, and it's perfectly understandable, this thought that we want to, and I'm talking back after the time of Jesus, we want to make this teaching something that is fixed so that nobody can argue with it. I could have said to this man when I wrote to him that Master said it and you've got to believe it. I didn't take it that far. I said that reason helps to support this. But if I were to say that it's absolutely this because he said so, that would be dogmatism. You can have dogmas, but it's not good to be dogmatic, because to be dogmatic means not to be open to any other possibilities. And so the church had that need at that time, or perceived that need, to get these teachings enclosed in a set definition. They were heirs also to Aristotle, whose definition of reason, his way of reasoning, is to say it has to be either this or that. That either-or mentality has found its way into the structure of all our Western education. I used to have a real problem with that when I was reading Master's interpretations, in fact, of the Rubaiyat of Om Khayyam, where he would say, well, this is what it means. On the other hand, it also means that. And furthermore, it also means this. I would think, well, I believe in him. I believe he knows what he's doing, but can he make up his mind? I had been so steeped in orthodox reasoning in the West that I simply could not appreciate that truth, like a diamond, has many facets. How different the Indian approach to truth has been. There's that delightful story of Chaitanya, who in fact was a great teacher, professor, very famous in India. But when he was converted to just becoming a devotee, he left all that. And he moved from Navadvip in Bengal to Puri. And there he and his disciples would devote their time to just chanting God's name. And there was a very educated and intellectual scholar in Puri called Sarvabhauma. And Sarvabhauma he saw this radiant young man and he wanted to help him. He felt that he's too innocent. He doesn't understand the scriptures with his idea of how scriptures need to be understood, which is with a lot of intellectual ratiocination. And so he offered to teach Chaitanya the scriptures. Well, Chaitanya was extremely learned, was famous for his learning, even as far away as Kashmir. But he was a very humble person, and he said, I would be very pleased to learn what you have to teach me. And Sarvabhauma took one passage of scripture and interpreted the same passage 25 different ways, which was a phenomenal feat. Mind you the difference. Here in the West, they would have said, now what is the one authentic and true way? What does it really mean? The Indian approach is that it's many-faceted. In this context, it would mean this, and another would mean that. Take the case of a child. If a little boy of 3 pulls out a toy pistol and says, bang, bang, you're dead, you might wish he would have higher principles, but you wouldn't scold him. You'd just say, well, he'll grow up. But supposing I were to come to you with a pistol, say, bang, bang, you're dead, you'd think, something's wrong here. It doesn't work. So the statement, the ability that Sarvabhauma showed to demonstrate, to bring out 25 meanings from this one passage was a feat of extraordinary wisdom, not just loose-mindedness. And Chaitanya said, well, that's remarkable. Congratulations. Since you've raised the subject, let's see if I can think of any too. He came up with about 85. Just unbelievable. But what's always fascinated me is not his brilliance in being able to see so much depth in that scripture and to see that truth from so many different angles, but the fact that there can be an appreciation for understanding that truth does have many angles. Now, the church did not want that because they had been brought up by Aristotelian logic and the classic Greek way of thinking and the either-or consciousness. And so they began to develop absolute dogmas. Well, it became very inconvenient for just any old Tom, Dick, and Harry to make a definitive statement, because you never know whether it'll be Tom or Dick, but somebody's likely to make a mistake. So better to let it be somebody who's in a position of authority, right? And besides that, however, the ministers all the priests can be, they can have their own take on things too. So better have a bishop over them who knows more securely. But, there are bishops, and better to have one bishop. And so finally it became the Pope of Rome. And everything he says is now considered infallible. It doesn't make it true, it's just infallibly what he said, but never mind. You can't have a thought or an idea and promulgate it to anybody without it being approved authoritatively. Now, the Gnostics were absolutely against that way of looking at truth and at the teachings of Jesus Christ. The Gnostics were saying that you've got to experience Christ and God for yourself. Now, this is what Jesus taught. He said it several times in different ways. And he made such amazing statements as, "Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect." Well, that kind of perfection is just inconceivable. So you sweep those under the carpet. But these teachings and these people who insisted that their experience did not endorse that, well, the church naturally would want to sit on that, squelch it, give it very short shrift. And they'd have to do the same thing with communities. These communities of people, all of them meditating, all of them trying to find God on their own, coming up with different discoveries. I see him as a tail hanging from heaven. I see him as a wall. I see him as a long hose or a snake, 4 pillars. I see God as light. No, I've never seen light. I hear a sound. No, but I feel love. No, but, and so on. All the different arguments that can go on. Well, the church felt, and you can see its point of view, the church felt it's a lot safer if these things are all controlled. St. Otto of Cluny, however, made the statement that the floor of hell is paved with the bald pates of clergymen. St. Teresa of Avila said that you've no idea what harm is caused by priest confessors who don't know the subtle truths of the soul. I know that the mother of a friend of mine from Yugoslavia was excommunicated by her priest because she read the newspaper. This kind of ignorance you find declared dogmatically because it's from an authority, and as a result you find some things that are, they're not inspiring. It's always going back to, well, what made St. Francis great? Because he was a loyal son of the church. Always it goes back to the organization. Well, God doesn't think that way. Each one of us is a child alone before God. As Master said, each one of us must make love individually to God. And the big struggle which the church succeeded in squelching was to knock out Gnosticism. And of course, if you're going to knock something out, you'll always present your best case and their worst case. And so what you read in books usually as statements of the Gnostics are pretty absurd. You can see why the church would be against that, but that doesn't mean that they didn't also have deep truths. Origen said that he got the teaching of reincarnation in a direct line from the apostolic times, from the apostles. It was something that was gradually, what are you going to do if somebody can say, well, if I don't do it this time, I can come again? Well, it's much better if the church can give you it right now. It's got you under its wing forever with that thinking. It's understandable. The one thing wrong with it is that it isn't true. Now, it would be natural for such a church also to say, well, as I was told, frankly, I'm not interested. Get rid of the churches, get rid of the communities, Get rid of any place where people on their own presume to find God and communicate with God personally. If one or two here and there manage to do something, after they're dead, if they haven't made too colossal a blunder, okay, canonize the guy. But otherwise, the way Christ's teachings have been crucified is purely and entirely that they've been Kali-yugaized. They've been confined in a structure. Truth has been confined. It's this and it can't be that. It's only this. It can't be anything else. We know, you can't possibly know. Who are you to say? You're not an authority. And so you find that the truth again comes down to individuals waiting to hear what they're allowed to think. Well, this is not the way to reach truth. When Master said I was brought back to teach original Christianity, that's what he meant. He also meant a technique that would enable people to have their own contact with God, not to let somebody else have that contact for you. You've got to. Each one of you is a potential saint. Each one of you has the obligation, the responsibility to seek God and to find Him for yourself. Now that's why Master talked so strongly, I mean with fervor, about communities. We see over these centuries that Christianity has been around, over these centuries that Kali Yuga has gradually evolved up to Dwapara Yuga, and as we come into an age where people automatically can't think any longer in terms of fixed realities. Everything is fluid. Everything is energy. Matter doesn't even exist except as a vibration of energy. This new viewpoint of things demands a new understanding of everything. Now that's the aspect of Master's teachings that it's been my job to do. I don't say that it's more valid. My thought is always, how do I reach out to people? But I don't think it helps us to say that it was so wonderful being with him and he was like this. I'd like to say he's right here, right now. The truths he expounded are things we can live. Master passed away from his body over 50 years ago. I was there. It was a great blessing. But it didn't end there. It isn't enough to just talk about what he was like and how wonderful it was to be with him. Everything, and you'll notice this in my book, The Path, everything I write about him, I wrote about him, everything I tell about him, it isn't to show you how cute he was, how delightful he was. Always there's a lesson behind it. And I've spent my life trying to meditate on what those lessons are. What's the significance behind his saying this, doing that? Because always there was a lesson in everything he did. Dr. Lewis made that statement too. Because they all understand. It's not that anyone's right and the others are wrong, not at all. Each one is just taking a little part of the whole and saying, this is it. But I think to reach out to people everywhere, you've got to bring it out in such a way that it's not just particular to a time, to a person, to a place. Master's teachings are for everybody. Master's teachings are Dwapara Yuga teachings. He came to bring not only techniques, very important to help you to experience this for yourselves, but also to give you principles to help you to understand that in all of life, there is a universal reality that is not particular. When somebody used the word sect, Master said, we aren't a sect. Again and again he said, we aren't a sect. He was not particular to one religion, one organization, one truth. No. It was universal. That's how he used to teach. That's why he had the pictures of other masters in his church around the sides. That's why we pray to the saints and sages of all religions. The hope for a better world that Master came to bring us is that, first of all, what we find in this century particularly, and I don't mean just this 21st century, but the 20th century that all of us have lived in, some of us almost through. And what we see here is a need for a universal awareness. We don't want dogmatism. We don't want to be told what to think. We want a new consciousness that enables us to find out for ourselves. And in every field, because people have brought this old knowledge with them. All of you have been to college, I presume. Even if you've only been to high school, you've all been indoctrinated with the same basic teachings that are mechanistic, materialistic, competitive, that think of mechanisms, not consciousness, as the reality underlying everything. Again and again, if you look back over the things that you've studied and were taught, you can't help noticing how totally anti-spiritual truths they are. Modern education is essentially atheistic. We have a duty to fulfill what Master brought, to show how, and this is what I tried to do in my new book, Hope for a Better World, show how under all that reasoning there are spiritual principles at work. That in fact they don't work until you inject those spiritual principles into them. One of the basic teachings of all those people, Machiavelli and Adam Smith and Darwin and Freud and Marx and all these people, one of their basic assumptions is competition. Everybody says, you've got to compete to get ahead. Well, Master said something very different. He said, by cooperation, you can succeed. You can make things much better. He said, in a town of, let's say, 1,000 people, each person with that old mentality will have 999 enemies. If they have a new mentality and each one looks on all as friends, collaborators in the same basic project, then each one has 999 friends, not enemies. Now this is what cooperative communities can teach. And people are learning it from us. More and more I see coming out in the country around, people beginning to say in orthodox articles, orthodox statements, beginning to talk about cooperation, beginning to talk about helping one another, beginning to talk about how it's more satisfying to work with others. It's not satisfying only to think in terms of grabbing, to share. These are things that are becoming, bit by a process almost like osmosis. They're entering into the society to the point where increasing numbers of people take them for granted. They don't know that they come from Yogananda, nor can we quite honestly say they do. Because truth is truth, and it's there for everybody. And it sort of wells up out of the ground. As my dad told me, oil was first discovered in Romania, where he was stationed. They saw it oozing out of the ground. So insights ooze out of the ground of consciousness. But it is true that he helped to give that energy a great power. As he said at that talk at Beverly Hills, he said, I am sowing these thoughts in the ether, and my words shall not die. He blessed the world with this consciousness that thousands of youths would go north and south and east and west, spreading these teachings everywhere. This is what we ought to take seriously with our own lives. These great teachings are the spearhead of a whole new consciousness. Now, mind you, you don't have a new consciousness without having a struggle from the old. And so what you're going to find, and are finding, but it'll be increasingly so, a real war between the two. We're living today in a war between light and darkness. Our choice is, do we want to serve darkness? Do we want to serve limitation? You don't have to call it darkness. You don't have to think of Satan as having a long tail and fangs and horn. But that thought which limits you, that thought which limits your ability to love, which says, I know and you don't, that thought which contracts your consciousness instead of expanding it, that is satanic. And it's particularly satanic in an age when the divine force seeks to expand. This new wave is the hope that Master came to bring to the world. And every one of us can be missionaries of that truth, not by being a formal minister or anything necessarily, just living it yourselves. That's why we have this convocation, this Spiritual Renewal Week, this convocation of seekers coming together. Convoke means to call together. To call them together so that they will reinforce their determination, their clarity, their understanding that we are not alone. There is this thing happening, and it's endorsed by many other insightful people. So this is what we want to talk about this week. Hope for a better world. Master came bringing that hope.